think our presentations today are all going to be quite different and rather intriguingly complementary in some spaces and not others. So I was sitting there this morning thinking, this is not what I'm taking the journey, but then perhaps that's entirely the point, and we must trust Natalia on that journey. I want to explore, drawing on some of my own research over a period of time, sort of 2008 to 18, a period in which in England at least and internationally Pearls and PISA have been hugely influential in framing how reading is seen, indeed influential in policy making. Yet we know that seeing reading as much more than a measurable result, as Pearls and PISA tend to, it's more of a lived experience or a socially situated process. And the work I've done, mainly through Teachers as Readers, 3-year project, and then with some additional research following that, has tried to look more closely at these concepts of identity, choice and agency without actually naming them as personalisation. Where I'm coming from. I'm interested in the reciprocity and interaction which has the potential to develop between teachers and readers. It's interesting to note then perhaps that the OECD's tripartite definition begins to take a broader view of reading literacy, recognising motivation behaviour alongside the cognitive characteristics. But it's true to say, is it not, that despite that recognition, many of the teachers in our country currently frame their teaching around the reading domains. Those reading domains which are the elements that are later going to be assessed, such as inference, summary, comparison or whatever, the absence of connection or the inclusion of, as I just said, those kinds of limited elements, summarising, sequencing, etc. So we end up potentially with teachers, as I would argue, in such an audit-driven culture, the kind of vital, personal, affective dimensions of teaching reading and indeed of being a reader can easily become obscured. And the potential for those kinds of richly reciprocal reader relationships between children and children and their teachers end up being kind of pushed to the margins. Yet it is, I would suggest, possible to build human connections between teachers and readers and texts, and to make the kind of life-to-text and text-to-life moves which are core to reading in their real world, in the adult's real world and in the child's real world. So I'm connecting here to what Catherine was calling earlier, making personal relevance, i.e. reading, arguably, but making meaning from it. As our research on teachers as readers and other studies has shown, if we take an identity lens, we can recognise that teachers' conceptions of readers frame and limit the young people's identities as readers, as Lee Hall's work from the States shows. We've taken in our work a notion of identity as plural, relational and positional, and obviously enacted an interaction, so not a static concept. And clearly then, we've seen teachers really challenged, as McDougall's work did several years ago now, but still continuing to be in phase 3 of our teachers' readers, where teachers see the world around them changing in digital terms and find mediating between what children wish to read and what they wish children to read, as many have identified, a difficulty. McCarthy and many others have highlighted the role of literacy in young people's identity construction, and if we wish to support young people to personalise their learning journeys and take a sociocultural approach, then we surely need to be helping teachers move beyond expecting young people to ascribe to the dominant models of identity or risk being marginalised in their classrooms. So, my kind of trajectory for this quick talk is around 3 frames, really. This is what I want to highlight. Reading teachers, that sense on our Teachers as Readers project, where we enabled and prompted teachers to develop an increasing knowledge of themselves as readers, to reflect upon their own personal reading journeys, their practices and preferences. And then to move to teachers' knowledge of their young people as readers, the second critical element if we are to personalise the reading journeys, to be able to enable children to find the texts that mean most for them. Then we need to find increased understanding of our children's readers, I would argue. And then the third strand on that, to highlight the significance of, not alone, but I've chosen just one strand here, of an RFP pedagogy, which is that informal text talk, reader to reader, about what we're reading, but also about us, about you and me, and what we might understand together. So we might have a text in common, a common bond that we can share, or we might have two texts, but we have life not in common, but lived, the nature of being human in common, and we can explore that humanity through the conversation that emerges. So I'm going to take a kind of quick journey on those three strands, drawing on these several projects. So in terms of reading teachers, Michel Comareas used the term originally to define it as teachers who read and readers who teach. And that kind of quite simple, really, but actually much more layered than those simple words imply. At that time, when we started the project and we were leaning on this conceptualization, the reading teacher studies were largely self-report, with almost no attention to what the children thought as a consequence of the teacher coming out as a reader, and no documentation in classroom context. It was really more an American kind of without being inappropriate, self-reflection upon what I'm reading, a kind of cathartic sharing of my sense of self, and then I'll tell the children about that, as it were, and see if it makes any difference. But nobody documented if it made any difference, and nobody invited the children to look inwards or to hold up a mirror to their own practices either. So it was kind of one-way traffic, really. If we move on to the strand of the teachers as readers research that we focused on, we invited our teachers in this, what was it, in first phase, a survey, but in second phase, an R&D project with 45 teachers. We invited them to engage personally as well as professionally. We spent a whole term here in London at Scholastic HQ with our 45 teachers, only reading. And they kept saying, when are we going to get to the classroom? When are we going to discuss what we should be doing tomorrow in the classroom? When are we going? We said, hang back. We're just reading and sharing our reading. We came together here. We also, teachers met up in their 5 venues across the country, Birmingham, Barking, Dagenham, Kent, Suffolk and Medway. So they were both frustrated because they couldn't be the teacher who teaches, they were being the reader, but gradually began to relax and go, oh, it's okay, I can bring 3 next time. And I can share something of myself on my reading journey. We invited them to develop repertoires of children's literature and supported them in doing so, and then we invited, critically, given the EF recent findings, them to develop their metacognitive knowledge about the social-cultural nature of reading, not by teaching them, by offering them MA classes, but by enabling them to read, reflect upon what they read, keep journals about their reading, and share with one another. We also transcribed a lot of what was being said, and we outfaced it back to them and then said, what does this mean? What's it telling us? And we encouraged them to research children's literacy lives. We used Gemma's category of these children can read but don't choose to, and each of the teachers chose 3 focused children who we also documented across the year as a research team. And then gradually, in the end of second, beginning of third term, we invited them to explore the pedagogic consequences of their engagement. In terms of the data collection, it's pretty large, really. I'm just going to kind of give you a sense of it. We had case studies 17 of these teachers, but we had the full data set, and the reading journals were one of the things I wish we'd written up. You know how you get to the end of a research project, you have more data than you possibly could. And I've still got copies of them, but it's far too late now. But it was just absolutely fascinating, and we got taken down other roads really and focused on the classroom too much, perhaps. It's a shame we never mined them fully. The underlying assumption around this was that the educational process could be enhanced when teachers learn about their own reading practice and everyday lives, and indeed develop their understanding of the children's and begin to develop pedagogies of reconnection around a reconceptualization of reading, perhaps. So, at the beginning of this particular TARS Phase 2, the autumn term, they did a lot of talk about children's texts. They always brought books with them and they blabbered about them in sessions in small groups that were transcribed and then, or audioed and then transcribed. Their talk about text was utterly dominated. Dominated is the key word. It wasn't occasionally, it was utterly dominated by the amount of work that this book, Hairy McLary, or this book, Owl Who's Afraid of the Dark, can dominate. 3 weeks' work you can get out of this, you know. Related to objectives, specific objectives. You could have a character with this one, setting or plot, whatever it was, you know, something behind the specific. And then it's the potential for integration into the wider curriculum. So this is great for World War II, you need it. You know? It's a book, and you need it to deploy it, to use it, to manipulate it, to abuse it, one might argue, for the study of World War II. When they talked, though, about their own books, their talk was predominantly, not utterly, but mostly, focused upon making meaning and connection, offering their personal views, their affective responses, very often connecting to my life, my father, my mother. I lent it to them, it reminded me of, and a long debate about social and cultural moral issues. Several of them were happy to be reading 1,000 Splendid Suns at the time, as it were, and I haven't got that right, yeah. And it produced also, it's Curious Incident of a Dog in the Night Time. There was a particular other text that was kind of a crossover novel that many were reading and created huge debates. So it was really interesting, and we fed back to them that massive disconnect. We said there's spontaneous talk here about meaning, about understanding, about caring, about you and the text that it's offering you, the meaning that it's offering you, and yet when it comes to the children's text, you never say anything in relation to what might be, the owl who was afraid of the dark. Haven't we all been afraid of the dark or unsettled by the noise? We were talking earlier on about being in strange hotels and not being able to find your way to the cloakroom. Doesn't mean I'm frightened of it, but I'm unsettled by that darkness. Yeah? So we can connect to the same principles, but these teachers didn't, and they didn't know they weren't, if that makes sense. So as we fed back to them that information, they said, well, we use books then to teach literacy, the skills, the tools. We don't use books at this time, or don't even see literature as worth reading for its own sake. So some voices here from the project. Teachers talking about enjoying books more now instead of only using it as a tool for literacy. Haven't got to work out where the prepositions are or whether it's got an ellipsis, or here's one colour-coded purple. We can all now teach the ellipsis because there are 3 in this book. And it's not absurdity, but that's being rude to the teachers, but it's a reality that's where the curriculum had framed their practice. This was pre-national literacy strategy, or during, and they were very clear that they were expected to mine these texts for these purposes. So as time went on, and I'm obviously characterising over an extended period, they increased their awareness of themselves as readers, analysed through their journals, analysed through various activities we engaged in. Many, for example, talked about reading the end of a novel. They would often read the end of a novel, and others were kind of affronted by the idea. How could you possibly read the end? We had to acknowledge that as readers, we have different reading practices. We're allowed those reading practices. They're personal to us, and we may or may not share them with others. There was a big debate constantly about what counts as reading then. Does reading the newspaper count as reading? Does it make me a poor reader because I flick bits and don't read the descriptive passages? I would have to put my hand up for that one too. If we're into deep description, I just think, come on, I want to know what's happening to the character here. And I flick until I find I might sometimes go back and reread the description, but truthfully, I don't always, and I don't feel embarrassed by that. I want to know what happens, thank you, in this book. It might be something different somewhere else. And so the teachers are quite open in discussing, sharing their rights, their affective engagement. But it wasn't easy. Many of them voiced these kinds of views that suggested to us within a highly strong accountability regime where they were working, they were unsure whether this personal stuff, this stuff about me, was allowed in the classroom, or indeed should be in the classroom. It's hard to know what you're covering, said one teacher from Medway, if you know what I mean. In a world in which you're given highly prescribed objectives to deliver, to get through, but you've got to put the success criteria were steps for success right up there on the screen for all the children to see, to check off in the plenary if they've achieved it, then a teacher is stepping off that very rigid route to learning. Well, I'm not sure it is a route to learning, but route to routine and boredom, is finding that piece very difficult. And we did have many teachers who actually said, I'm enthusiastic about reading, but I'm not going to share anything of me. This is not right. This is not what I came into the profession for. I'm a teacher. Which was antithesis to the way some of us saw it, but you have to go where they are. So we eventually identified a kind of what we call the climb, on which we placed the teachers after a massive debate and analysis of their evidence and their logs and their interviews and so on, with teachers who we saw as more developed as reading teachers. Now that wasn't a subjective judgment, but there was evidence to do so. And then we looked at the evidence from those teachers' classes. So we had a strong continuum, and then we grouped them within that continuum. And saw that in the classes of the teachers who'd become more developed as reading teachers, the young people had shifted more on their attitudes to reading, on their frequency. This is self-report, clearly. The knowledge and perception of their teachers as readers. Most of the children at the beginning of the year, when we asked them the question, is your teacher a reader? As one of the kind of survey piece, and do you like it when your teacher reads aloud? They had smiley faces and all sorts. Had limited knowledge of their teacher as readers, weren't able to name anything their teacher was reading. She reads to us what, we can't name it, as it were. In fact, we had a large number of children, depressingly, who didn't like reading aloud, very large, right across the study where we're case studying 3 kids. Very often they went for the face, and to start with we're like, what's going on? Reading aloud, for goodness sake, this is a space where we bond, where we share, but if in fact, as they told us, you're doing work straight after it, she reads to us before we do our writing. She reads to us, then we do our comprehension. And to them, the association with reading aloud was attached to a written task post. There might be all in between, but finally it was written. So reading aloud was work, just one part of it. Yeah. And therefore derided in their eyes, or at least not derided, in their eyes seen as labour, rather than seen as enjoyment, story time, dream, imagine, connect. So we made an argument that these teachers, and I believe we could see so, certainly in relation to their teacher-child relationships, were much stronger. But of course it wasn't just being reading teachers. These teachers also developed their knowledge of the children as readers. You can't develop reciprocity if you're one way. They focused themselves on beginning to explore what children's passions, preferences and practices were at home, and they began to consider over time and with support the difference that new knowledge might make. That difference it might make to what counts, to what texts are available, to what Miss might expect of you, and to the available reader identities. Clearly, teachers not only frame the identity positions available to young children in classrooms, but children also adopt, reject or adapt those that are being offered. And we found teachers using very strong concepts of good readers. The good readers are on this table, and the poor or impoverished or inexperienced, labelling and disabling in many ways because of that label. So we invited the teachers to explore their own reading practices, share those with the children, and invite the children on that journey. So here's a more recent one. This does not come from the project, it comes from a colleague of mine, but so visually engaging that I'm offering it to its same principle of doing 24-hour reading. We did a lot of 24-hour reading. We did it ourselves as team members. We invited the teachers to do it, and the teachers in turn invited the young people. Another visual of a 24-hour teacher who simply made a massive list of all the things she was reading in 24 hours. And then beginning to recognise that she was talking more about reading in classroom, sharing views and swapping books. They know I read the newspaper and I don't always agree with what's going on the paper's perspective. That sense of opening up, sharing, reflecting and recognising that across 24 hours we are readers of a wide range of texts. And one is not necessarily rarefied across another. There are all sorts of ways in which we personalise our reading journeys. If I'm passionate, which personally I am, I love cooking, then I'll be reading a lot of cookery books, or I'll be reading a lot, actually I don't these days, I mostly read cookery stuff off my iPad, as it were. Look up a recipe, find which one's got 5-star, read 3 of them, go back to the first one possibly, and select the one I'm now going to work with. So making my journey, and they began to do this in schools too. Another strategy the teachers used, building on Gabrielle Cliff Hodges' work from Cambridge, where she used reading rivers with teenage children teenage young people looking back over their reading history slightly differently. We invited the unmotivated, disaffected readers, as well as the motivated ones in classrooms, to share their reading rivers, taking a passage of time and reflecting on the cut. And if you just look at this particular visual, it's really struck me that as educators we can learn a lot when we listen and enable them to share not in words but in visuals that mean I can go back to this, remine it, and indeed to take all the girls who might have a similar inclination and begin to say, well, I work at a guided reading group here, to stretch them there, to offer them that, to make those kinds of connections. Because we know that unmotivated, disaffected readers fail to benefit from reading teaching, as Guthrie and Whitfield and many others have shown us. But to motivate them, we surely need to find what works for them. What works for them now, where I might stretch and enable. One of our teachers found out sadly, that this little girl in the middle, that's a picture of her when she was younger. She found out sadly, well not sadly, it was a great delight to find it out, but I'm sorry that she didn't know that this young reader could read in Polish, and did read in Polish. And the teacher didn't know until the comics came in and were stuck on this particular poster. The teacher was, dealing with new information she hadn't known before. More contemporary ones, again, showing in different ways, as professionals do, opportunities to begin to say, who am I as a reader, but also, who am I? What do I care about? And AFRA's here. As John Biddle, one of the colleagues in a website we've launched connected to all this work, highlighted when he did his own reading rivers more recently, he said, I was much less aware of the online reading they did, as well as the magazines, comics, etc., that they enjoyed. Very clear consequences that as educators we find out more about these young people, then we can tailor the opportunities to have a wider range of texts in school, but also around subjects that they're interested in. In phase 3 of the project, I'm just going to touch on this briefly, we invited the teachers and supported the teachers. It's a different project, but it was connected, it was a third phase, with different teachers, bar one, to make learner visits to children's homes. So taking Louis Moll's work, really, Funds of Knowledge, and taking the teachers, or letting the teachers go, but supported by us back at base, we didn't go. They needed to make their own journeys to visit homes, not as teachers to tell, but as learners to listen, and to find out more about the reading and everyday practices of the young people in their homes. It was built on homeschool knowledge exchange and many other studies. And this Wordle was just one of the many that we created, trying to support the teachers in what are the key features for you. Got to be child-centred, we need to be non-judgmental. It was quite challenging project, quite frankly, because we were asking teachers to hold a mirror up not to my reading practices, but to my assumptions and stereotypes, my values and perceptions, which I may not know I have. And we started with a brick wall of assumptions, which I won't show, never have, but we had one. And then we created gradually an asset blank of new knowledge. Kind of, let's be positive, let's look what you found out that's of benefit to you. So, am I in the way of this visual? Sorry. So we created an asset blank of new knowledge when they had visited, when they came back. Much was found. I'm just going to give 2 little windows of examples. This was Sophie. She picked Jo, one of her 3 children, to visit. They visited all the children 3 times, some 4 and 5. Some stayed to supper, all sorts of interesting things happened. But in terms of, Sophie visiting, she experienced teacher, deputy head, but she felt very worried about it, very stressed. She was suddenly in a different positional identity herself. Instead of being in power relation, they've come to school, they're sitting at my desk, I'm powerful, I'm teacher behind the desk or even beside it, and I tell them I'm going to their home to find out, to look, to learn. She saw Jo as a problem. She also, I haven't got the quote here, but she also saw Mum as a challenge because in her view, Sophie's view, Mum didn't support Jo. She kept turning up in sports gear, and she thought that Jo's mum was, going running and doesn't even volunteer to come on school trips and so forth. She's just going running. She's really keen on sport. And of course, a whole lot was revealed when she went to the home. Mum was a single mum at home. Dad was abroad. Lived there for years, as it were. Came home a couple of times a year. And also, she was training for the police, and she was training to get fit. And she went running after the first thing, dropping off Jo and brothers at school. But Sophie's view was that Mum wasn't coming into this context. So, in terms of a weeny bit, quick new knowledge about Jo. She learned more about his cultural interests, passion for computer, related reading and drawing. He did a lot of reading to his sister, which he just, I remember I was Sophie, I was case studying Sophie, and I remember her just being utterly amazed that he reads to his sister. He doesn't read in school, he never reads in school, he never finishes anything, never gets his homework done, and he's just going home. She said, I thought to start with doing it, to show me. And then we went in the other room, and he was still doing it, but it was another book. And his mum said, oh, he does that all the time, he loves it. She said, how are you meant to know? You just don't know. She learned a lot about his capacity to finish, to listen, to stay focused. And she was challenged too, because actually she drove them home. They lived in a rural community, and she actually ended up driving Jo home on 2 occasions. On another occasion they met in half term, and so she went independently. So Jo was minding her, with questions. What about this? What about that? And she didn't know the way, so she had to rely upon Jo. So he was in a kind of quiz-miss session, which was quite the antithesis to what she'd experienced before. As she said here, he does so much. He's the eldest, he does some of it independently. At school he doesn't have the same space or opportunity, I guess. He's talented at drawing, and he often draws characters as well as family and dogs, mainly dogs. He's desperate for one. He wanted a dog. She learnt about him in this conversational context at home through talking to Mum. Just a teeny bit on Carol, just another child. This was in a city, London, actually, some part of London. And Carol noticed that in Cole's home there was the Countryman's Weekly, which was singularly unlikely in the centre of London, as it were. But she spotted it lots of times, bird spotting book. In the garden there were bird feeders, and in the kitchen there were binoculars. And she learnt about his fascination and practice with his dad, which was fishing, ferreting and hunting, and what they did together. Now, there were clearly classroom consequences, not just for those two, but for the wider range of teachers who learned about through the reading rivers and 24-hour reads. They developed their knowledge of these young people, and they were therefore able to value a wider range of texts, make more specific, tailored text recommendations. Of course, you can't do that if you don't have a decent knowledge of kids' literature and of text. You can't read the poem about ferreting or hunting if you don't know a poem about ferreting or hunting. So you've got to know the kids, and you've got to know your books or your literature or non-fiction. But then it began to trigger, and which is my last strand, I'll be very quick, Natalia, on this informal text talk. Now here I'm connecting to Aneshka's work, where in her work with adult readers, she's highlighted, as others have in this adult reading analysis, that adults derive significant pleasure from text talk, and particularly from activating life experiences through mental imagery, personal memories, self-identification, self-relevant trait identification, and thinking about possible future selves. In the curriculum, do we ever have a section called Making Connections? Who does it remind you of? When does it remind you of? Did that ever happen to you? We might have that in the piece in between, but I'm working with, at the moment, 18 schools on 2 groups of whole school development projects. And when I asked the other day a question about making connections, somebody said, but that isn't one of the objectives. And I thought, yes, that's rather the point, isn't it, really? What is reading in schooling and what is reading in the real world? And I'm not saying they are ultimately at loggerheads, but if we don't understand what adults do as they read and how we make meaning, we are disabling young people to become readers. So in these contexts, we found that teachers and children, as well as children and children, develop reading conversations as a consequence of this new knowledge about their text in common, about their values, their views. And these very highly informal, non-assessed, often spontaneous, but not exclusively so, opportunities develop new relationships, reader-to-reader relationships, human-to-human relationships, and that began to affect communities of readers. So teachers talked about voicing affective responses. It made her cry. She cried because they got gassed. And then children beginning to realise, I can talk about that stuff too, because she does. It's all right either to cry, it's all right to be angry about what that man did in the newspaper to that dog, whatever. It's all right to have a view. Indeed, it's all right, and should be encouraged, to afford readers' rights. We didn't actually go from Daniel Pennock's book, The Rights of the Reader, or indeed Quentin Blake's poster. They generated a whole list of things. And they thought, this is what I do, and I have the right to do it. I have the right to skip bits, I have the right to read the end, and yet I never extend that right to the children. It never occurred to me. I mean, they're learning to read, aren't they? So we shouldn't let them do it until they've learned to read. But what if they're a free reader? And what if, in fact, we're putting them off that reading journey by not enabling them to personalise their reading journeys by exerting their rights? So eventually folk did find the poster. Actually they found it for us, we didn't know it existed, and focused on books that started but didn't finish. Come and find out why. So to close, there was a strong focus on shifting the locus of control from the teacher who was holding the reading reins, taking, or indeed perhaps taking if you're holding the reins that way, driving a buggy or whatever in some case, in some way, on the horse, you've got the cart behind you. Instead of driving the children in a particular direction, they were actually shifting the locus of control, so this became agentic, reader-led. If reading for pleasure is anything, it's volitional reading, choice-led reading, therefore it has to have agency and identity at its core. So the last couple of voices from the teachers. Being a reading teacher makes me feel more connected. We seem to have more in common now. Through sharing my reading life, I share more of my own views and values, and, well, they've opened up too. And then another one. I know so much more about them as readers and, well, as children. So for me, whilst this isn't the whole story, there is an interesting connection between holding up a mirror to myself as a reader and understanding or reconceptualising for myself the nature of reading. And then beginning to say, if that's what, reading teacher, a teacher reads and a reader who teaches, and then explores what might the consequences be for my young people, and do I know enough about them and their practices to take that journey further forward? And if I do, then one of the key things alongside reading aloud, social reading environments, independent reading and much more, is that the conversations around reading will shift to conversations, not comprehensions, question and answers, not teacher-led and then child-answered, but often spontaneously led from the youngsters. So, a last word, I always think we need to give the last word to the people we're learning from. This teacher saying, through reading, swapping and talking, I've got to know my class really well, as individuals with different interests and different histories. I can't quite believe I never knew all this before, which I think suggests, as Stephen Ball does, that we may have moved from a culture of authenticity and openness in the classroom to one potentially of plasticity, his words not mine, where we actually frame the opportunities to develop reading and understanding who we are, as it were, in particular packaged governmental ways that are arguably interpreted by the profession, but are then assessed by others who come to check you're doing it that way. To do it that way doesn't seem to personalise anything, let alone reading. I hope that was interesting.